Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be taking you through some special techniques you can use with your serger. I have the Amber Air S600 set up, and I'm going to talk about piecing quilts with your serger and how you can kind of make some changes that are a little bit different from the traditional changes you might think of. I personally love to use the blind hem foot when I'm piecing because it gives me a nice bar on the edge. I'm going to show you how this works and how to set it up, and I also do a couple of other things that are a little bit different from your normal techniques that you might see anywhere else online. So the other thing to think about is when you're piecing a quilt is you need to get pretty accurate cutting if you want to be getting your pieces to all turn out okay. And one of the things to consider that I want you to think about is when you're cutting your pieces and then you're measuring them, the best way to test to see whether or not your seam allowance is an exact scant 1/4 inch is to cut your pieces the same width, sew them together. I sew, when I'm piecing quilts like this on my serger, I'll sew 2 pieces together, and I don't sew the next third piece onto it. I'll sew sets of 2, and then I will sew each set of 2 to each other, so then I'll have 4, and that is going to give you a lot better results. If you take a piece like this and you sew one set and then you just add a next one on and a next one on and a next one on, you can find over time that each piece is going to get a little bit longer, and then the rows tend to have a curved look to them. So by sewing sets of 2 like this and then joining the sets to each other, you're going to have a much straighter set of fabric pieces, and you're going to be happier with the results. Now, the thing that's important is if I sew these all together, all these pieces, when I'm done, they should measure up to 12.5 inches if I've sewed a scant 1/4 inch. If I haven't, and I'm working with something like squares, like when I cut these all apart, they're all going to get sewn together. They're all going to be the same piece. It really doesn't matter if you've got a scant 1/4 inch, a 1/4 inch, or 3/8 inch. The end piece will be a little bit of a different size, but as long as all the pieces are the same size, it really doesn't matter. Where it matters is if you're sewing squares and triangles and rectangles together. And in that case, you really do need to have an accurate scant 1/4 inch. The other thing that can affect your results is your rulers. So if I'm using one ruler, this is a Husqvarna Viking ruler that I have, and I'm using this to cut my strips together, but then when I go to subcut them, I use a ruler that might be a different brand. Each of these rulers could have a tiny little fraction of a difference. And so you might think, well, I cut the exact same way, but 2.5 inches on this ruler and 2.5 inches on this ruler are not the same. Every brand has got a different way. I know it sounds ridiculous, right? But every brand has got their lines or different widths, and where you're lining it up to might be a little different on this ruler compared to another ruler. And so it is an important thing that as you're cutting and subcutting, that you try and keep your rulers the same brand. I have no favorite brands. I use a lot of different rulers. I probably have 20 different rulers, but I've learned the hard way that if I'm going to be working on a project, I should keep the rulers the same brand as I'm going. If I'm using a long ruler and a square ruler, try and be consistent about the brand you're using for the project. So that's something often we don't think about when we're doing this. Now I'm going to go and pull up the serger, and we'll come back in a moment, and we're going to talk about the best way to set up your serger so that you can get your scant 1/4 inch. So this is the close-up of the blind hem foot that I like to use, but you can use the traditional foot that comes with your serger, and the only thing you want to be doing is not cutting any of the fabric away. You want to cut all the edges of the threads, but you don't really want to be trimming your fabric down when you're piecing a quilt on a serger. So what this does is it gives me a guide. Now you'll notice that there's 2 screws. There's a screw on the top, and then there's a screw on the side. The screw on the side is going to move this bar left or right. When I'm piecing a quilt, I'm going to move that bar all the way to the edge. You'll see it lines up over here with this little stitch finger. I move it as far to the right as I possibly can. And that is going to help me get my full 1/4 inch seam allowance, or scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. This screw up here, if it's tightened down, it will be hard to move this. So this one, you can loosen this, and then you can move the screw left or right so that you're moving the bar all the way to the right. And then you can tighten this down again, and that stops it from shifting as you're working. So I'm going to put this foot on, and I don't know if you'll notice here, I have yellow thread in my left needle. I have set up for a 4-thread overlock. A lot of people, when they piece a quilt, tend to use a 3-thread narrow, which gives them a really easy way of doing their 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I personally like a stronger quilt, and so I like to use the 4-thread, which means I'm going to use 2 needles. I have the needle in the left and the needle in the right in the A and B position. And so when I put a yellow thread in that left needle, because when you're deciding about what a scant 1/4 of an inch looks like, that yellow needle, that is the deciding factor on how wide your seam allowance is going to be. So I chose a different color thread. You have your upper looper here, the bottom looper I've got about the same color, and then I have a blue thread for my right needle, which is the B needle. But the yellow one is the one that is deciding what my seam allowance is, and that is going to be the left needle if you're doing a 4-thread. Okay, and so I'm going to put on my foot, and let me just move my arm, lift this up and drop it down. And let's see if I did that right. There, now my foot is down, and I'm going to open this up a little bit just so that we can come in a little closer here. Another factor that's very important is where my blade is set. So normally when I'm doing a 4-thread overlock, it's recommended to sit this up at a 6.5, and that you'll find right here, this knob. When you look at it, the numbers are on this side, and I left it at 6.5, but you can adjust that if you need to. If you feel like you want the fabric, if it's cutting and you don't want it to cut, you can move it to the right or you can move it to the left. And as it moves, as you change the dial, you're going to see this blade is going to shift left or right. I'm going to close that up right now because I'm going to leave that the way that it's set. And I have my material set on a woven medium. Although if I felt like as I was working that I needed to, I might change it to a woven light. And if I did that, the tension changes a little bit, but the stitch length doesn't. And when I was using it with a woven medium, I found that the tension was perfect and everything was great the way it was, so I left it on a woven medium. So I'm going to put my 2 pieces together, right sides together, and I'm going to line them up together. And my goal when I'm doing this, to test this out, is I'm going to put my fabric underneath my foot, and I'm going to line it up right where the bar is. And you'll notice there's just barely a tiny little bit of the metal stitch plate that's showing up. Okay? And this is as far as I can get the blind hem foot to go. If I felt like I needed to do a wider seam allowance, I certainly could move this and have the fabric go underneath it and line this up with this very edge, and that would give me a wider seam allowance. But if I'm going to use the blind hem foot, I try to move it as far as I can over to the right, and I'm lining up my fabric so there's just a tiny hint of the metal of the stitch plates showing up. And that is going to give me my scant 1/4 of an inch. Now, if I leave the stitch finger set at normal, it's going to give me a very wide seam allowance, which is going to be more like 3/8 of a seam allowance. And because I'm using a 4-thread, it'll give me a nice strong quilt, but it's going to be wider than a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I have 2 choices. I can either use, and if I come up here and I'll show you this, I can either take out the A needle and just do a 3-thread narrow stitch, or I can pull the stitch finger back. Now, normally when you're doing a 4-thread, your stitch finger is going to be set in the end position. But I found that if you pull this back, and you can control how much of a seam allowance you're going to get by how far you pull this back. If I pull this back to the rolled hem position, I am going to get a really beautiful 4-thread, and it's going to be the scant 1/4 inch that I'm looking for. All right, I'm going to do this a little bit and show you. And I stop, just like if I'm piecing a quilt on a sewing machine, I'm going to stop and line it up and make sure my fabric is lined up on this side. And when I'm doing something, I can actually tell if I have fabric underneath that's showing. That means that the 2 pieces of fabric are not the same length. I know when I did this one here, after I pieced it all together and I went and subcut it and sewed it together, these 2 pieces, the orange one was a little wider than the rest of the pieces. So when I sewed them together, they didn't match up perfectly. And that's because this piece wasn't cut as accurately as I thought it was. And that happens sometimes, but you can usually tell when you're sewing 2 pieces together. If you see one piece is wider than the other, then you know something's going on. Now, notice how I have my finger down here. I'm just kind of keeping my finger here, and it is really controlling my fabric, so I don't have to push or pull. I don't have to line it up. And if I come back here and look, you'll see that looks like a pretty nice 1/4 inch seam allowance, right? And now I call it a scant 1/4 inch because that's generally what we're looking for. And the reason for that is that when you go and you sew your seam, and afterwards you go and press it open, there's actually some of the fabric is taken up in the seam allowance. And so that's how we got in the habit of talking about a scant 1/4 inch as opposed to a carpenter's 1/4 inch. Because when you're dealing with wood, it's a hard item. A 1/4 inch is a 1/4 inch. When you're dealing with fabric that has some flexibility, you're going to get a different result if you have to turn the seam allowance. It takes up some of the fabric. And so that's how we've gotten in the habit of using and talking about a scant 1/4 inch. So if I'm going to be piecing and strip piecing, I'll usually do all these sets one after the other. I'll start the next one up after I finish this one, and I won't cut the threads. I'll just keep going. And when I'm at this point, I can just set my next 2 pieces in and start going from there, and then I can continue on. Once I've sewn all this sets together, then I'm going to come over to my iron, and I'm just doing it a small iron here, and I'm going to set the fabric. This is called setting the stitches, and I usually will have, if I'm going to be working with different color fabric, most quilters believe that you should have the seam pressed to the dark side. So if you're going to press it to the dark side, then that's the side you would have on top. And then once you've set the seam, then you're going to go open it up like this, and you're going to come in and take the flat edge of the iron and move it over and make sure you've got a nice flat seam and that there's no extra fabric in the seams that hasn't been moved open. And then you're ready to subcut into smaller categories if you were going to sew them together in that way. Or if you wanted to put more strips together, then you could start sewing your sets together. Now, what I did was after I had 4 pieces together here, I cut them up because I'm going to be making 8-inch finished squares. At this point, I've measured it, and I can measure, and I'm sure that this is 8.5 inches. And then when the final edge gets sewn together, that's going to be 8. If at this point it ends up being 9 inches or 8 3/4 or 8 1/4, then I know that I don't have my seam allowance set right. And that's something that everybody needs to do for themselves. But that's the important part about this, all right? When I sewed these pieces together, all right, and I'll lay them down here with a square on top of it, this piece should be 12.5 inches. But when I laid it down, you can see I have almost a 1/2 inch of extra fabric on the end. And the difference in the seam allowance between this piece and these pieces is very, very little. So it's amazing how much of a difference it can make. You almost can't tell by eye, and that's why you really have to do this test of sewing them together, see what your end result is, and if you get it exactly at 12.5 inches, then you know that you've got your perfect scant 1/4 inch for the way that you quilt and piece. Now, in this case, this piece is 8.5 inches. It's just the perfect size of what I need to do. And I'm going to sew these sets together like that. And I'm going to be making a square that's going to be finished size 8 inches. The challenge is on a serger, you don't have quite the control you do on a sewing machine. And I kind of found this really cool technique for making sure that the seams are butted up against each other. Because we press to the dark, the seam allowances, this one here is on going to the right and the one underneath is going to the left, which is just perfect. And you really want to make sure that they're butting up against each other and lining up. But I had this really cool idea. I have a few different types of fabric glue. This is a new container for Roxanne's Basic Glue. And what I did was I just put a little dab. This glue goes away very, very easily. When you wash it, it just washes out from the quilt. And so I'm going to just press it like this. It takes only like 2 or 3 seconds. And I can just take my little extra glue that I wiped off here like that. And then I can make sure to set that seam so they're lined up just perfectly. And if a seam is not going to line up very easily, then I know I might have a problem. And then I'm just going to come over here to my last seam. And I'll put a little dab here, and you can see it's just almost too much when I do that. All right, and then I'm going to line this up like this. And now, in a couple of seconds, I can open that up, and I can match and see if that seam is going to line up perfectly. But the nice part about it is when I go to my serger to piece this, I don't have to worry about these pieces shifting as they go underneath the longer foot of my serger. That's going to hold them in place, and I have no reason to have any pins or clips anywhere near where the blade's going to be that's going to get in the way. All right, so I'm going to move back over to my serger, and we're going to just reset the camera, and then I'm going to come in and I'll show these to you, and then you can have a look at them and see how good a job I did. All right, so when I start, I use the knee lift to lift the foot up, and you can see the knee lifts down over here. You might see a lot of mess over there too, but there's my knee lift. And all I'm going to come in is, and I can set, have a little peek and make sure everything looks good. And then as I start to sew them together or serge them together, I don't have to worry about them shifting because that tiny little bit of glue is holding everything in place and giving me exactly the finished results that I'm looking for. Now down here at the bottom, I can see I haven't got that fabric. It's kind of shifted over a little bit, so I'm going to make sure that that lines up. All right, and I can actually feel that those seams are butted up next to each other, because if they were overlapping in any way, it would be bulkier and I could feel it. And I can also see down here at the bottom that these are lining up pretty well, this end result. These are lining up just perfectly. So I think my seams are probably going to be matching up perfectly. And if I could give you any tip, I think this is the best tip in the world. And I'm going to serge and come up here and cut. And now let's see how good a job I did. When I open it up, all right, look at that. My seam allowances are matched up pretty well, aren't they? So I think this is a really cool way of making sure. And you can go to the iron. Look at that, how beautiful that is. And so that, using that little dab of glue, took away a lot of the challenging parts about piecing with a serger. So if you know something is really important, that it has to be done a certain way, then that is the easiest way to make sure that you're going to get that perfect matching seams exactly the way you want them to be. All right, look at that, how nice. You can see there, they match up just perfectly. When I go to press them, they're going to line up just perfect, and they're going to give me the really nice results that I'm looking for. So, after sewing all my sets together, I have a square. What I noticed is this side is perfectly 8.5 inches, And this side, the ones, as I put all the rows together, then this ended up being a little bit wider. And so what that means is when I was subcutting, after I put the strips together and I subcut them, I was cutting them a little bit wider because the seam allowance stayed exactly the same. Nothing changed about the seam allowance. And so, often we kind of wonder why it is that you get different results than you expect. And there's so many different reasons. So as you're setting yourself up, now the way I set up my serger is completely different. You can set up your serger and do a 3-thread. As I said, I like a 4-thread. I feel it gives you a nice strong quilt. If you've got kids pulling and tugging at something, this 4-thread is going to give you real strength. And you notice, look at how neat and tidy it is. There's no threads hanging off. Everything is completely finished. So when you're done sewing your quilt together, it is absolutely perfect and you don't have any threads or anything on the back. Now, if you're just going to make a quilt with all different colors of squares, as I said, these squares could be 10 inches, 12 inches, 2 inches. It's kind of up to you how you want to do it. But if the piece is the same, who cares what the seam allowance is, right? It doesn't really matter. But when you're going to subcut them and put different shapes together, that's where it becomes important. I know most people might find that the blind hem foot maybe not necessary. I personally, even if I need to make a deeper seam allowance and the bar will not go any farther to the right and I want a deeper seam allowance because I need that to get my scant 1/4 of an inch, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the fabric run underneath it. But I like that visual of the blind hem foot bar. It gives me a little bit of accuracy so I can see that the fabric, whether it's on the left or the right, is staying parallel. And my goal is to not trim any of the fabric away. I want to trim all the threads with the knife and trim all the threads that are there, but I don't want to be trimming any of the fabric away because that's going to affect my ultimate size. All right, so let me bring this up here a little bit like that. Look at how nice the back looks. So I suggest everybody give it a try. Pull out your serger. If you've never pieced with a serger before, give it a try and see how nice it is. I find it's really satisfying. The best thing is once you've got your serger set up the way you want it to be, then you can zip out a quilt in no time at all. It is really possible to do a king-size quilt, like a log cabin quilt, in a day. Because once you know your serger is accurate, you can just zoom through and you'd be amazed how wonderful and the finished results are. So I hope you give it a try. And if you have the blind hem foot, give that a try too, because I think it's really kind of a fascinating way of using it. It's a little bit different from the traditional way. And remember that stitch finger that was set to normal for most 4-threads, you can adjust that. If you want to have a smaller seam allowance, by pulling it toward you, you can reduce the size of your seam allowance to be anything you want it to be. So give it a try, and I hope you will experiment with it and let me know how it goes. I'll be looking in the comments to see if anybody's got any questions. Bye, everybody.